This is a very basic question. Why is reparations, because I think you're actually committed to saying it should be backward looking. So I mean, you could say about certain kinds of punishment or retribution, it's got to be backward looking. But would punishment be backward looking or forward looking? Why is backward looking reparations somehow?
Well, I think our understanding is that it is essentially. I mean, that's what we're repairing a wrong that's done. I mean, it's in view of wrongs done. I think there are enough complications about it because the whole idea of compensation is often tied in with monetary compensation in the total system. But we have no measure for really attaching a figure to an injury. I don't know how that even develops, but that's one reason why I was thinking today, more than I have in the past, more concretely about the specific injuries and repairs of the specific injuries, such as prosthetics, medical care, education, and so on. Not to rule out other kinds of compensation, but those are clearly reparative. They have to be. And they wouldn't be reparative if we didn't think that the injuries were wrongful, or that they were injuries in the moral sense.
Have you looked also at reparations in other countries? Because they must be faced with a similar problem.
Yes. I mean, I guess the most familiar case is Germany after World War II. Reparations that was paid. But my understanding is it didn't pay them to individuals. But I think, for various reasons, I haven't tried to enter into that, deal with here. In the main, the kind of reparations that I'm thinking of wouldn't go to individuals. I mean, under Thaddeus Stevens' proposal, it would have been land allocation and so on. It would have been individuals receiving it. And there could have been identifiable individuals to some extent who could be held morally liable and therefore legally liable. But I'm thinking that what we can attach to the previous systems are deprivations that we can see statistically. So what you want to do is to eliminate those statistics, so to speak. Well, that's why thinking in terms of equal opportunity or equal life prospects seems promising.
So I'm going to just ask you the conventional questions about collective responsibility here. Well, two of them, there are many, but two of them go together. One has to do with the group-based nature of your analysis. So a group was harmed, obviously. That's not so controversial. But the reparations are now owed to another group. You might say it's the same group. And they may be called African Americans. Or you may say that they're individual members. So my question here is, who is the group that's now owed reparations? And to what extent do they cohere as a group? And are you talking about them as a group versus, say, individuals? And the second follow-up question is what they get. I'd like very much what you think they should get. So that's not my question. My question has to do with whether or not what is owed people now has to actually balance out the harms. So some people, as you know, argue about reparations as a balancing act. You got X amount of harm and now you deserve X in return. That's sort of a positive content or benefit. So the second part of the question here is, do you have to try to balance, I hope this is not the case, because it's impossible, right? So I hope it's not the case, but do you think that there's an argument here for balancing the harm with reparations? Or are you just trying to repair as much as you can, given that there were harms?
Yeah. Implicit in what I was saying about monetary compensation is that kind of balancing is impossible. I mean, as I said, we have no method for that. Groups. Part of the first question had to do with
Yeah, who's being compensated?
Who's being compensated?
Individuals, is it the same group as the group that was harmed?
you can't now compensate dead people. What you can do is undo wrongs that result from past policies now, wrongs now that result from past policies. Leaving aside the possibility there may be specific cases, Tuskegee case is a good example. Put that aside, but we can acknowledge specific cases. Wrongful imprisonment, people railroaded into prison and so on. And a lot of that is, there are innocence projects that are dealing with that sort of thing. It's the existence of disadvantages that I think we can attach to past policies. Or, yeah, let me put it that way. I won't try to embroider it any further. If those past policies were wrong, and they result in what we would normally consider inequities, then we want to get rid of them, not just presumably policies. We don't do redlining anymore, but we do want to eliminate the disadvantages that flow from redlining. So I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to repair the wealth gap. But that's one of the major problems.
Let me just follow up quickly about the group then. I understand all the way through history, multiple harms are created in secession. But the identity of the group itself might be viewed in at least two ways, if we're talking about groups. One, those people who are suffering the harms now, and two, people who have a particular racial identity. So what kind of group then are you talking about? There may be 3 or 4 or 5 different other kinds of ways of dealing with that group, but what is the group identity itself? Because you've talked here about harm, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about people who are African American who are not harmed, or what about the racial component in any case?
Maybe the following would clarify my view or raise further objections. If we, I mischaracterized my proposal in one important respect. Because I assume that if we try to promote equal opportunity for newborn children, then there'll be a lot of poor white kids who will be benefited. So it's the kids with the disadvantages that will be benefited. But it's no fault of their own. So the question then is, what kind of social mechanisms put them at a disadvantage? We want to get rid of those. For housing, for health care, unemployment, for infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to help some white kids. Good. So I'm not thinking in terms of a group.
You're thinking in terms of those who are suffering from...
But the rationale for doing it is, look, we know that these inequities have flowed from past policies. Well, at the same time, there's an argument for promoting equal opportunity. Okay, let's do it across the board. You know, that's the idea.
James?
I'm just, I have a really basic question too, and I think you already kind of answered it. But I'm just wondering, you know, I know you're keeping it in the moral arena rather than political, and you had kind of said that, you kind of said at the end, you know, it's not feasible to actually feel like this program can actually be instituted politically. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what action, it seems like some action should be taken, but I guess I'm wondering if we can't expect political action to be taken, what do we do, and then who does it?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. Trying to figure out how best to say what I have in mind, but we have to be opportunistic. That's one way of thinking about it. That is to try to find the leverage, the political leverage, when it's available. So, for example, unemployment insurance seems to be enormously important. In general, but specifically in these cases, because we know that the unemployment rate for people of color is much greater than the unemployment rate for whites. So if we address the issue of unemployment insurance and also the prevention policies that will prevent recessions and further stretches of unemployment, then we're going to be attacking. Now, as it happens, it's going to be very difficult to extend unemployment insurance, but you would think that that would be one of the issues that would be relatively easy. Well, no, it turns out. But if situations should change a little, for example, or there are opportunities to defeat a particular political candidate, maybe an incumbent who is opposed to the extension of unemployment, go for it. We have to be organized. Can't do it alone. So we need political organizations that will be dedicated to these things. Some of them single issue or clustered issue organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union or the Center for Constitutional Rights or Fellowship of Reconciliation or Human Rights Watch. You know, there are lots of organizations all around. Support them. Be active yourself. Of course, if, apropos of that, I'll go beyond the question here. In thinking about culpability, it seems to me that if one tried to identify people who could reasonably be held to be culpable to some extent, it's the people who accepted without protest. Now, one should be careful about this because the weight of American society was so much that of minimizing the importance of racial injustice. Do you have incredible judgments made? I mean, I'll give you an example. This is really going beyond it, but it's relevant in various ways. The literature on civil disobedience, this is really going beyond. literature on civil disobedience in the United States really developed in the 60s and 70s. Most of the original literature took the position civil disobedience needs to be justified because it involves violating the law. And there's a presumption in favor of respecting the law, political obligation to control. Now, it's very interesting that those theorists who were sympathetic to reform and to civil disobedience and the civil rights movement, get to that later, assumed there was a general obligation to obey the law. Without thinking clearly, how could there be an obligation to comply with Jim Crow laws? How could there be? There couldn't be a blanket obligation to obey the law. First of all, you couldn't give the argument, and King discusses this in his letter from Birmingham jail, you couldn't give the argument, well, these were democratically established laws. King says, what do you mean? We've been disfranchised. How can they be democratically established? Right? So that argument for the law, secondary argument for respecting the law doesn't work, aside from the problems about the laws themselves. So the problem I'm addressing here is that people of goodwill who were writing articles in philosophical journals in defense of civil disobedience were nonetheless assuming there's a general obligation to obey the law, when I think that was a morally implausible position. I took the position before I began to reflect on it. It took a long time for me to be persuaded. And then when I was persuaded, I realized it's crazy moral to think that you could have a general obligation to obey the law when you have fundamental injustices in a society. So that's what I mean by being very careful about making judgments about culpability. Nevertheless, the population at large accepted Jim Crow for generations and didn't fight it. So there's a problem there about culpability. And I went way beyond.
Follow up from Rachel?
Yeah, so this is actually a follow-up to Mary's question. So, I guess what I was wondering is if with our reparations, this is sort of a question that you're used to that word actually, if we can't really compensate for the wrongs, and not only people of color will even be helped, in what sense is that even reparations and not just social equality, separate from the whole issue of slavery and Jim Crow?
We can't undo wrongs. What we can do is take action in light of the wrongs. Dead slaves can't be compensated. Dead slaveholders can't be held liable. Although that can be qualified a little bit. But we can look at the past and say, here are policies that were either at the heart of a system like, say, Jim Crow, the most recent such system, or that supported it. And these disadvantages flow from it. So we say, these are the reasons for getting rid of those disadvantages. That's backward looking. Because, I use the example of redlining. I didn't explain. Let me explain. People who loan money, banks and companies that gave loans, would either not make loans in those communities that were lined in red on maps because they were black communities or mixed communities, or they would charge higher rates. So it was impossible or more difficult for African Americans to acquire houses or to improve the houses under those circumstances, because they couldn't get mortgage loans, they couldn't get home improvement loans. Or they had to pay more so they could do less, and therefore the wealth accumulation was held back. So that's a policy. The policy was endorsed by the federal government, but it was a policy of banks and realtors. And we can trace the effects and say, this is why we want to get rid of the disadvantages. It's not because blacks were imprudent. They made bad choices. They wasted their money on expensive cars, et cetera, et cetera. The statistics don't hold up that way. So that's why it's reparative. That's the idea. Not persuasive. Go ahead.
So I guess in that sense, like, wouldn't reparations be like finding those people who were affected by those policies, like actively doing something specifically for them, and finding maybe all those people who were affected, rather than just instituting like overarching social policies that will target like all of them, or all the people who are disadvantaged. Reparations seems like it needs to be targeted to those who are affected specifically.
Well, yeah, sure. In some cases, you can find individuals who are specifically affected by certain policies. For example, people who are wrongfully imprisoned. In other cases, what you have is general disadvantages. How are you going to attack that? I don't know what mechanisms would be appropriate to undo wealth gaps that result from past policies. If that's the result of wrongful policies, then a way of getting rid of the results of wrongful policies is to attack them. But that's not what we know is statistically people. Well, let me put it differently. We don't know what decisions individuals have made that may have affected their specific family circumstances. We will never be in a position to know that. We do know that policies have profoundly affected family circumstances. So, in those cases where we can identify individuals who have individual claims, let's deal with them. In those cases where we cannot identify individuals who have specific claims, but where we know that there are inequities that result from past policies, let's deal with the inequities. That's the idea. That's the best I can do.
Follow-up from Rob? Yeah, this was a follow-up to James's question. So I guess it's another political question, so sorry. But it's about the relationship between the forward-looking and the backward-looking components. You had recommended opportunism or pragmatism in getting these things done politically. I was just wondering about a maybe ironic result of that prescription. Do you think that oftentimes that pragmatism or that opportunism would mean a de-emphasis on the backward-looking component that you've tried to raise today? In other words, it seems that, as you said, equality of opportunity and forward-looking concerns are much more politically feasible or politically resonant, it seems, than the backward-looking concerns, which can at times be politically toxic. So you mentioned, for example, the Affordable Health Care Act and insurance. It seems to me that those things have enough trouble getting passed if only the forward-looking concerns are brought into it. And it seems to me that the people who try to get those laws passed particularly like Barack Obama seems to have made a strategic choice while in office to de-emphasize racial concerns. Whether or not that was the right thing or the wrong thing for him to do, he seems to have thought it prudent, and it seems to have worked in certain circumstances. So, I was
Well,
just wondering your thoughts on that.
let me give you an example that is based on history, but not on actual strategy as far as I know. The federal government in 1953-ish supported the appeal to the Supreme Court that became, or the cases that became consolidated into democracy. I think there's a consensus that one of the reasons the federal government took that position, which was a great break with the past, as was Truman's decision in 1947 or 46 to establish the President's Committee on Civil Rights and to come out with various actions such as the decision in 1948 to desegregate the military. There's a consensus that one of the main reasons for this was the Cold War and the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for alliances with markets in and resources of new countries that were becoming independent, which were populated by people of color. The United States was getting a very bad press. And this was aggravated during the 60s. The Kennedys were very upset with King because he wouldn't back off from Birmingham. They were very unsupportive in general. And they didn't try hard enough, for example, to get the FBI to change its policy. It was very difficult under Hoover, but nevertheless, they didn't try hard enough. Especially when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General. But there's a strategic opportunity. Exploit the opportunity. Let the pictures be displayed around the world of Southern police attacking peaceful demonstrators, because this is what really was very embarrassing. That's the kind of opportunism that I'm thinking of. Don't put them at risk. Although when they created the Children's Crusade in Birmingham in 1963, there was a lot of questioning in the black community about putting kids at risk. However, it turned around. When they got abused, they got the support of the community, as I understand. So, there's a case of opportunism. Now, I'm also thinking of other kinds of. What I didn't mention was this. There are very good things happening all the time on a small scale locally. It's amazing. And if you don't get literature, sort of the right literature, you'll be ignorant of this. A very good example of the right literature is a little publication, that's about a dozen pages, called Labor Notes, which reports on labor developments that are very interesting and very important. These things are always happening. Right now, for example, the Service Employees International Union is organizing Agile. Very, very important program, which I've been called upon to support, and I support. That's not quite a local thing, though they're doing it on a city-by-city basis. So Boston is one of the target areas right now. There are things like that happening, and the thing is to support them when they happen. That's a kind of opportunism. But the point is that resistance to oppression never stops. And people trying to reform the current state of affairs always happen. It's amazing. So,
Follow up from Todd.
Yeah, this is back to Mary and Rachel's just to sort of push the question of what the reparations language is here. So I wonder, so it seems like, so you're saying to Rachel sort of that the idea is that it's these past wrongs that justify the reparative sorts of actions. And I'm wondering if the conclusion from that is that without these sorts of past wrongs, we wouldn't have justification for remedying these current injustices. So, and that seems like a little sort of a strange way to say it. And so what I'm wondering is if this is sort of further impetus for social inequalities that we already recognize and we want to fix, or if this is supposed to be the only reason. So that, I guess.
you can have more than one reason.
Yeah, that's what.
That's the short answer,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I thought. But
I mean,
yeah, so I guess-
think about the former slaves.
Mhm.
They deserve compensation for what they had been through. But you wanted, presumably, if you were democratically inclined, you wanted to promote their economic and political independence so as to construct for the first time a democratic society in the South. Those two objectives fit together, they're not contradictory.
Yeah, so I guess then my question sort of shifts to a political. If that's the case, what purpose is reparations language sort of serving? If it's something that seems politically pretty problematic or is very controversial and maybe more controversial than just social equality concerns in general. So I'm just wondering if there's
The question, let me put the question in slightly different terms and see if this is part of what you're going to come up. Would it be better to downplay the reparations argument if that raises hackles? I don't know if that's possible. That is, I don't know if, I mean, it might be. But I don't know if we could achieve what needs to be achieved without thinking in those terms. And the thing is that American public really needs re-education. I mean, there is this illusion of a post-racial society. And it ain't post-racial. The incarceration problem, for example. Enormous. A good example, for slightly different purposes, is the voter ID movement. Now, it affects African Americans and other people disproportionately because it affects people who don't have resources. But it affects poor people generally. So there's a double argument there. Just as there was during the Reconstruction period, what you want is to make the polls accessible, and it's going to be accessible to everybody, not just to people who had previously been disenfranchised deliberately. The effect of disenfranchising poor whites in the South was, what do we call it? what's the term that we use when it's secondary?
What?
In military circumstances, there's a certain term.
Collateral.
Collateral damage, right. And there's a case where collateral damage was objectionable to some, acceptable to others, but it's bad, right? Does that help?
Yeah.
All right, Max, follow up or hand or some of both?
So be able to figure it out.
I'm wondering what relevance the non-identity problem has to your justification for now giving something to currently living people for things that have happened in the past. And the worry I have is that, in a way, currently living African Americans benefited from the policies of slavery and Jim Crowe, because had they not been put into place, the particular set of people now existed would not have existed most likely. They would have remained in Africa, they probably would have married and mated with
Well,
the,
wait a second. They would have remained in Africa? Who?
the slaves that were actually brought over.
But we don't have any of them.
We don't, we definitely don't.
So the current African Americans would have remained in Africa?
I mean, not necessarily,
No,
but,
no, they wouldn't have existed.
yeah, sure. So, sorry, okay, yes, they wouldn't have existed at all. Yeah.
Construct the argument again, start again.
Sure, okay. So, had slavery never happened, the currently existing African Americans would have never come into existence. So in a way, these currently living ones are better off for that policy having been carried out. Because they would have not existed. So they have hardships, obviously, but existing and having hardships is certainly better than never having existed at all.
Well, for some,
Wait,
for many.
For men.
Better than not having existed. I'm not sure what we're comparing. Are we comparing two lives, one of which existed and one of which didn't exist?
Yeah, I know. At the very least, they're not harmed by it. They're not made worse off than they would have been. I guess that's one
They
thing.
wouldn't have been.
Correct.
So what we have is the construction of a society with certain inequities. What's the alternative? No such society. But not an advantage to them. Where's the advantage? See, you've got to get the comparison. If they wouldn't have existed, there wouldn't have been a slave society. Okay, there wouldn't have been slavery. There's an advantage to having a slave society.
No.
Well, then where's the advantage?
Actually, currently existing is the advantage.
As opposed to what?
Never having existed.
I don't know how we can compare those two things. Frankly.
I don't exist.
I mean, suppose you bring a child into the world in order to torture it. That's a clear example. So he's better off because he's brought into the world than if he hadn't been brought into the world, but he's tortured.
Correct. So the one exception to this kind of argument is that if the person is given a life not worth living. So obviously a life where you're
I
tortured.
didn't say it was not worth living.
Well, that's obviously a very difficult case, but obviously most African Americans currently existing are not being tortured every day.
Right? Yeah, I'm
They're
just-
much better off than that.
But what you want to do is introduce lives where the claim is that they're better off because they're alive, regardless of the conditions under which they're in. That's irrelevant. Because the value of having been brought to life is so great that it dwarfs everything else. Is that the argument? Do you really want that argument? You want to endorse that?
I don't want to endorse it. That's just an argument that's brought up. Shauna Schifrin has an article on this, and then volume the non-identity problem.
So,
It still seems to me the case that you can't, well, maybe I'm just not understanding you. It just seems to me the case that they're giving people things now is sort of like Because the policies you're talking about are all fine, I think they're perfectly justifiable because of inequality. It's only trying to justify them in terms of, hey, we did this terrible thing a long time ago. Which,
Oh, no, it's not just that we did this a long time ago. It's that the results of those policies continue through the present. This is not reparative of past non-existent wrongs. This is reparative of continuing wrongs that current people are experiencing.
okay, but even then,
But it's backward looking because it's policies that were instituted in the past. We don't have Jim Crowe any longer, supposedly. We don't have slavery any longer. But the inequities that were created weren't repaired, but were re-entrenched. That's the argument. So it's not that we're compensating for past wrongs for people who can't be compensated. We are trying to get, the argument is to get rid of continuing wrongs.
okay.
And I don't see that non-identity problem being relevant.
I guess I was thinking in terms of, I thought you were saying benefit people now for things that happen to other people.
No, it's the policies that continue. Now, we may find cases, I said, individual cases or classes of cases where we can identify, say, victims of police abuse, victims of false imprisonment, victims of various kinds, or families that were affected by lynchings and so on. It probably wouldn't be so difficult to find many such cases, but that's not what I'm primarily concerned about. In a written version of what I was doing, I would mention those specific things in addition, but that's not the primary problem, it seems to me. I mean, that kind of problem is a problem partly because it continues to exist. Because we still execute people, because we still imprison people wrongfully and so on. And what we wanted to do is, part of the reform would be to get rid of those police and court policies that do that. But it's not a matter of compensating for past wrongs. Yeah, no. That there's a whole set of very complicated problems. For example, there can be, it seems to me, liability without culpability in cases of what lawyers call unjust enrichment. The children of slave owners arguably were unjustly enriched. That's a first approximation, because the Grimke sisters, who were daughters of slave owners, became radical abolitionists, argued that the families of slave owners actually are corrupted by that experience. But nevertheless, they were also given benefits that they wouldn't otherwise have. Nevertheless, I don't think it's the case, for example, that all whites were generally enriched by the slavery of Jim Crowe. I think that there were many who were disadvantaged. For example, it was possible under Jim Crowe to recruit blacks as strikebreakers. And that's partly because of the policy of the trade unions of excluding blacks when there were such policies. And so I think that was the disadvantage of whites. So on the one hand, you have all of these complications. So I think it's in many cases going to be very difficult to identify individuals who have benefited or suffered, but we can identify more readily policies that create disadvantage. That's the sort of orientation.
Well, how are we doing with time?
It's 5:18, so a few more minutes.
I I'm not, this is not a well-formed question, it starts with an image.
I don't have a well-formed answer.
Well, I have an image, I'm thinking of affirmative action, and I'm thinking of the first image that we got from President Johnson about why we're having affirmative action. And I think it was stuck in one of his speeches by Dick Goodman. And it was this image first of a race, but the picture was of some of the runners in the race were shackled, and they were further back. So what we have to do at least is take the shackles off. But that's not enough, because we take the shackles off and they're still behind. So we're gonna move them up. And then, so we're gonna stop the race, take the shackles off, move them up, and then restart the race. And this moving up, so it was somewhat backwards looking and also forward looking. It had some of that same, right, double a double representation of kind of looking forward and looking back. But the reparations, what you just said just most recently, well, the response to the so-called criticism that you wanted to respond to, is the answer, well, maybe it isn't reparations, or no, it is.
It is.
It is. And
It is. It should have an explicitly explanatory component,
right.
and it can have an additional justification at the same time.
Right. Okay.
But it is backward looking.
Yeah.
Shall I say something about affirmative action?
Yes.
I was the department chairman for several years. And we were required to do some things, but let me tell you, they were pretty pathetic. I don't remember affirmative action making a damn bit of difference at the university level. And at the same time, I remember having to persuade my colleagues to hire a black candidate who was, and if I gave you his name, you would realize he was extraordinary. We had a lot of trouble being persuaded of how extraordinary he was, even though he was on the scene at the time, not in the department. And I take that to be one of the factors, the kind of factors that affirmative action was intended to counteract. And in fact, the original language indicated that affirmative action, I think there was another term used instead of affirmative, but should be taken to make sure that there was no discrimination. And that there would be a good pool of candidates, that we would go out of our way to go to make sure that people who would normally not be considered fairly. So I know of very few cases where there were quotas. And the only case I know of was a case, a very important case. It went to the Supreme Court, Steelworkers versus Weber, and decided in 1979. There's a case with a very good reason for having a quota. But affirmative action is it's a non-issue in most cases. That is to say, it's very difficult to find an example where merit is not adequately being taken into account. Most of the time, it's a question of letting merit be properly taken.
All right, follow.
No, this is a very good question. Does anybody else have a follow-up, or do you have a question? Because you haven't asked one.
So I did have a bit of a follow-up about affirmative action, in as much as I did want to put into this. I agree with you that So often it's so tempted that it hardly matters, and even where it is, it seems inadequate. It certainly would be adequate for the sort of reparations you're talking about. But if you could have a really strong affirmative action policy as part of a general policy of reparations, well, I still wondered if even a really strong affirmative action policy would count as part of this. The reason I wonder this is there are a lot of really good prospective arguments for affirmative action.
Diversity level.
Exactly. But some of the shortcomings that have been noted for it is if you have something like, say, a really strong quota system, it's still most likely to confer benefits on those who were least disadvantaged by past injustices, in most cases. And moreover, those, especially the farther you get from the actual injustices, I mean, not only will no slaves be benefited by affirmative action, but in addition, most of those who are most harmed by Jim Crowe are far enough along in their professional lives that affirmative action isn't likely to help them. So affirmative action is more likely to help people the farther they get from being those who were even sort of suffering the injustices at the time. So it seems like a policy that can do a lot of good, but explicitly pulls away from precisely those who were most directly hurt. So I wondered if even a strong affirmative action policy would make sense as part of reparations, or if you almost have to call it something else besides.
You know, my initial reaction, as you were beginning to develop this question or point, was to think of general policies. How do you go about helping people who have disadvantages that are unearned, undeserved, and result from past inequities? You have to invest. For example, this may seem like an irrelevant example, but I'm particularly sensitive to it. I don't know if I ever would have gone to college if I had paid tuition. I couldn't imagine my family paying tuition. It was possible for me to go to college because I could go to free college. So I started out at Cooper Union, which at the time no longer was tuition free. And then when I decided to switch to philosophy, I was an engineer. So when I decided to switch to philosophy, I went to Brooklyn College. No tuition. It was feasible. That's not true today in the City University of New York. That's a problem. And the increasing cost of public education is an increasing problem. Do we spend money on things that would better be spent on education? Well, I can think of Iraq and Afghanistan for two things. You know, I have on my office door a quotation from Eisenhower in 1953 where he says something to this effect. I forget exactly what he said. Every dollar spent on a battleship is a dollar taken away from a child. That's affirmative action. That is redirecting the dollars to where it would be more good. Now, if you redirect the dollars, for example, to serve the part of the population that is least served, it's going to be, broadly speaking, the least advantaged members of society who will have remedial programs, college opportunities, skills training, job opportunity, career possibilities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And it'll affect a lot of people of color. That's affirmative action that I like.
You have 2 more minutes, so.
Here's a big question, which you probably wouldn't want to hear, and that has to do with blame. So reparations builds up responsibility, in this case collective. Collective responsibility often requires a sense of blame, it doesn't have to. My question is this, can you in your schema do without blame? Would you want to do without blame? Is there blame involved in terms of the policies you're talking about? Because I haven't heard it at all.
Yeah,
I've heard a lot of-
use the terms.
I've heard a lot of social equality, which I prefer, but I'm just wondering whether you've thought about this and whether you do feel that you can get away from blame if you are going to be looking backwards and talking about reparations, at least partly as something stemming from the past. It's a mixed thing, but at least partly in the past. Or whether or not you do actually have to come up with some conception of blame, and would that create problems for you?
Well, I know it creates problems for me.
No, for your way of looking at
Well,
this.
I'm not sure. It might, but I've spoken, I referred to wrongful things. I haven't used the term very much, but I think in terms of culpability, which is directly related, of policies being wrong and people who are responsible for those policies presumably are wrong. Let me give you an example of blame. Washington and Jefferson believed that slavery was unjustifiable. They were racist in their views, but they believed that slavery was unjustifiable. They weren't willing to give up their slaves. And they weren't prepared to argue for abolition. That's a problem. Are they blameworthy for it? Arguably.
No, for sure, I would argue along those lines. I'm wondering about 2014 and whether we can extend blame all the way up to present generations. That's a problem if we have to politically. That's one of the biggest resistances to reparations is, I don't want to be blamed for something I didn't do.
Right.
So I thought you were actually trying to get away from blame, which I liked. Then I worried that you couldn't. So let me pose the question from 2014. Can we talk about reparations now without talking about contemporary individuals as blameworthy? And maybe clearly those old guys were blameworthy, right? You know, racist. There was intentions.
Yeah.
They knew what they were doing. But what about in 2014? Do we need to talk about blame if we're going to talk about reparations?
You mean current
Current blame. Do we need to?
people?
Us.
Yeah,
us.
us. Yeah. Yes, us. Yeah. Yes, I think we do.
And so where's the blameworthiness come from?
But look, I mean, I don't think that moral judgments should be thought in very simple terms. It's a problem of ethical theory to frame moral judgments in terms of right, wrong, good, bad. But I think in our everyday lives, if we are morally sensitive, we think in much more nuanced terms. Because we know more about the individuals who we may be tempted to judge. And we also know about ourselves. So knowing about ourselves and how complicated our own histories are, if we think of other people realistically, we will recognize that their histories are complicated. And a lot of what they are is inherited. We inherited the world we live in. We didn't make it. And it takes takes a lot of courage to fight it. That's one of the most difficult things. It takes a lot of courage, very often, to be a dissident. So I think that blame has to be very carefully allocated because it's very difficult to generate the kind of motivation that's necessary. And very few of us can do it. And you can't blame someone who can't act otherwise.
Well, that's what I was asking, so it sounds like you don't absolutely need it to talk about reparations.
For the kind of policies I was talking about, no. But to talk in more inclusive terms, yeah.
And I was
think so.
talking about the specific policies.
Yeah, yeah. I think so.
That puts us about out of time, but thank you very much.